Okay. All right then. Welcome. Welcome. All right. Oh, okay. We'll be starting in just a moment if there is audio now. There will be audio, but then there will be sound, and sound will be thought, and thought will be a voice, and things will be things. This will be this, and that will be that. We could start a sound parade off such scat as we have ransacked. Of course, always, we are voices crying, each in our own wilderness, assembling a point in which all other constellations of thought radiate and come together, at least and are balanced by, in the attracting forces and the repelling forces, and the various ways in which things come true. Okay. Upon the palimpsest of time and space, may I go right ahead? Hear from Radio Rimbaud. Greetings this evening. This is summer solstice also. Welcome, O summer, and on behalf of ourselves, O summer, I welcome us. I do not know if we go toward you or you come toward us. Well, it has been mentioned in history many times of a figure, a prodigy. There have been many prodigies. Rimbaud is one of many, I would think. And I cannot anticipate the way or back engineer the way Rimbaud has come to anyone's attention. We speak of him when we speak of a poet, and we do speak of him when we speak of an adventurer, and a rogue, and an enfant terrible, and a prodigy, and of one whose trajectory is, if not all that unusual, it's become the archetype of a certain kind of trajectory, a certain kind of meteoric kind of a contribution to literature that occurs within the parameters of the time and space life, compressed in such a way that everything that happens within that body of work, within the poems and all the other writings and the mystique that accrues around the story. Within all that, you can trace, you can just see so much that is so fascinating about how a certain kind of creative energy manifests in the world, and it becomes a myth. Then you might say the myth of the person of Rimbaud, the adventurer, the figure, the silhouette in history. Yes, the one who stopped writing poetry by the age of 20 and went on to become a merchant, jack of all trades, explorer, soldier of fortune in a certain sense, a seller of guns to Emperor Melenik in Abyssinia, a coffee trader in Aden, in places that are now Somalia and Ethiopia, and all these places in between, an explorer. That's the adventurer part, you might say. But then you also see it early on, you see the peripatetic wanderer in these explosive times. Explosive times, it must be mentioned that the times are such that in France, when Rimbaud was about the age when he was going to Paris and running away from home, escaping from the provincial control of his stern mother, and the strictures of provincial life, despite being such a brilliant and awarded student, he runs away from home looking for the more explosive areas of life, and he finds them. Actually, he doesn't have to be very far from the explosive areas of life. When I think it was New Year's Eve in Charleville, in Rimbaud's hometown in the Ardennes. Oh, I don't know how far from Paris. Some 200 miles or so northeast of Paris. I'm not sure, but they were under bombardment. When Rimbaud was 17 or so, I think it was 1869 or maybe 1870, it was the very midst, and the battlefields were very close by. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871, it did not last too long. These were explosive times. Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew, I believe he was called Louis Napoleon or Napoleon III, he was the titled head of the empire, and the empire had, in a certain sense, in an industrial sense, had prospered so much so that it was, the nation of France was of the same kind of like a national power and energy in a mercantile sense as England was by 1867, but yet at the same time the lot of the workers and of the poor was not much, nor was there much freedom or liberty of expression allowed. And because of a reckless foreign policy, perhaps, or because of the ambitions of Bismarck over in Prussia, there was a war broke out, and it was against the Prussians and the French, and it did not last long with the military aggression and discipline and skill and whatever it is that gives victory in the battlefield. The Prussians, were able to overcome the French in a matter of 6 weeks or so. And the government, I believe that Louis Napoleon was taken prisoner by the Prussians, and a new government was formed after that one was dissolved because of this. And under the pressure of working out an armistice, which would greatly favor the Prussians, an armistice that ceded to them Alsace-Lorraine, which they would have for the next 40 some odd years until the next war. There was for a very short time, there was a republic. Well, was it a republic? Yes. It was a republic in Paris. It was France declared a republic. I believe the president or the prime minister or what have you was named Thiers, Thiers. But it did not last long either. It lasted only a matter of days, and they fled or they collapsed under the Prussians and their onslaught. And then a provisional government or a national assembly was formed in Bordeaux. So this was the government of France at this time, but this was in Bordeaux, away from Paris now. The Prussians had by now encircled Paris. This was 1869 or 1870. An armistice was signed. The Prussians got what they wanted, which was Alsace-Lorraine. So they encircled Paris, and other than making a victory parade, they did not bother to invade, because that would just be too much of a messy thing now that they'd had what they wanted. And so at that time, there was impossible to imagine what the feeling was like for an individual living through such times, I'm sure. But Paris had a mind of its own with regard to the rest of the body politic of France at that time. And in about March of 1871, there was formed the Paris Commune. And this became, for a very short time, a very different expression of political thought and values and ideals. They were oriented toward the needs of the workers as such, and to easing the burden upon them, and to mitigate, to ameliorate the effects of being taken advantage of by the rapacious, moneyed classes. And although Marx was around at that time, or there was kind of an international of socialists in Europe at that time. It was beginning to happen. This is as early as, this is the 1870s and stuff. And they were not as much represented, though, I think, in the Paris Commune. No, I think the influences there was that one revolutionary named Banqui. He was old and in prison still, but he was very influential. He was a socialist anarchist, a socialist who they all knew that power could only change hands by force. And though there was a very nascent conception of actual government by the workers, it was kind of like socialism from above or by an elite, kind of a conspiratorial kind of style. This was Banqui. And then there was Proudhon, and his vision of socialism was more of a village type, a William Morris type of utopian socialism, compared to what they were really looking for, which was to maintain industrial might, only turn the control of the factories and the means of production over to the urban proletariat. So it's this kind of beginning, to have this kind of vocabulary or style. And they did achieve some of that in the short time, 6 weeks, a couple of months that they were in power. They brought forward the notion of a minimum wage. Maybe for the first time, I don't know. I'm sure there's all kinds of precedents for it. But these things, which are so common now, sometimes we don't realize that one time they were unknown to civic thought. And collective ownership of factories and the means of production, that was actually put in place. Rent relief was also put in place. And these kind of things were truly happening. It really was a government that was responsive to the actual needs of the working class. It was very influential and very, very romantic. And it ended very sadly and very violently and very explosively in late May of 1871. And who was it? The Prussians? No, they didn't need to come in at all. It was the French army, the government, the National Assembly in Bordeaux, reasserting their influence and power in the way that it often is asserted, through the sword, the cannon, the gun, the street-to-street fighting in late May of 1871. And the communards, as they were called, they had their last stand up on Montmartre, and they did have a cannon up there, or maybe more than one cannon, that was advocated for and placed. And supposedly people attribute, they ask themselves, how did the communards get the artillery to put up on top of Montmartre, which is what gave them, that was the beginning of the Paris Commune, and that was where the last throes of it took place. Some say that it was Louis Michel, the revolutionary, they called her the Red Virgin, the socialist Joan of Arc. These are things that enter legend and stuff, but in reality, her voice was heard over the parapets and on the platforms, and she had written a great many books and pamphlets, and like some say it was because of her that they moved the cannons up there on top of the hill, and from there they had the power to actually, as we call it now, power, as they called it then, without a doubt, the power to start the Paris Commune and everything that happened after that. I just wanted to mention Louis Michel. And there were a great many others too, their names, Proudhon, Blanqui. These are nascent, or that's a relative term, isn't it? Anyway, these were the days of the Paris Commune. But New Year's Eve of 1869 or so, Charleville, Rimbaud, on his farm or in their little house in Roche or Charleville, they saw the bombardment and the cannonade of a nearby fortress or armory, and it was through those very grounds, those very places, the Ardennes, sometime later, that Rimbaud, one of the many times he did this, ran away from home to go to Paris, there to make his name known as a poet. He'd been corresponding he had been able to send them letters, and though they had not published them, many had replied to the well-known poets of that time in Paris. And so, in a certain sense, he created the connections that would bring him there or draw him there. But on the way, that's where we hear the stories of all the things that he saw, and as an example of the poetry that begins to appear as an example of an early example, though early means different things when you're talking about a figure like Rimbaud, but as an example of some of the styles or poetic appeals that he moved through. We can begin to see it even in some of these poems as graphic as they are in another sense. This poem is called A Sleeper in the Valley. It's no doubt based upon what he saw when he was in between Charleville and Paris, in the aftermath of this Franco-Prussian War, and before the explosive days of the Paris Commune, but just before. As you can see, there was a pause, I suppose, when they reloaded their rifles, as the proverb goes. But anyway, Rimbaud wrote a poem called A Sleeper in the Valley. A green hole where a river sings, silver tatters tangling in the grass, sun shining down from a proud mountain, a little valley bubbling with light. A young soldier sleeps, lips apart, head bare, neck bathing in cool blue watercress, reclined in the grass beneath the clouds, pale in his green bed, showered with light. He sleeps with his feet in the gladiolas, smiling like a sick child. He naps. Nature, cradle him in warmth. He's cold. Sweet scents don't tickle his nose. He sleeps in the sun, a hand on his motionless chest, 2 red holes on his right side. So, A Sleeper in the Valley, it's a poem about a dead soldier. And yet at the same time, we could talk about the poem a long time. But notice in the first 4 lines, there's a green hole where a river sings. That's when you look in between the waving trees and you see, on a downward slope, you see water. That's where the river is. You see it through the trees. The trees are waving in the breeze. A green hole where the river sings. That's what the line suggests to me. And then silver tatters tangling in the grass. Those are the reflections of the waves, of the rippling waves, of the wind as it dances across the surface of the river singing in the green hole. And then a sun shining down from a proud mountain. A proud mountain, that's like something in a fairy tale. And then a little valley bubbling with light. A little valley bubbling with light. And what a psychedelic line that is. Isn't that so synesthesiac? Bubbling with light? Is light a liquid? Is light a gas? Does light move in that way? Well, it certainly does when it's perceived with the eyes of the imagination. A little valley bubbling with light. As simple and as psychedelic as that, I just want to say to you, Rimbaud is a writer's writer. And he both knew and did not know what he was writing as an artist. But to be so present to one's perception, which press on one so immediately in such times as these, war-torn times when your poetic gift is bursting out of you as well as things are bursting out outside. And to hear the bubbling of the light, doesn't that tell you that there's more going on than meets the eye? Things are not as they seem, but it is a naturalistic poem. It's about something. But Rimbaud, breaks free from restrictions of this kind, and then comes back again and again. But I want to say one more thing. There's other poems early on, and they have known this in France for a good little while, all the 20th century probably, more and more they found years ago, schoolwork of Rimbaud, and all kinds of marginalia and school exercises and notebooks from the time that he's like a mid to young teenager. And he's a writer's writer. It's utterly tremendous, you see. Why? Because we can look at it, and because our ears and minds and imaginations have been tuned, oh, this is Rimbaud. Oh, this is his Juvenilia. Ooh. But we look at it and we see tremendous areas of very interest, of deep interest that illuminates actually, that poetic mind. And among them are a great deal of Latin exercises and imitations of other poets and marginalia where, like in the pages, like in reading some of the historians, the Roman historians and perhaps the Greek historians like Herodotus too, he takes off on certain tangents and kind of speaks in their voices in a certain way. Or at least you can imagine that's what's happening when you look at some of that writing. And maybe we'll go into that a little bit too. But I also want to tell you, you can also draw from that, I think we can, and come to have a sense of how he felt about the Paris Commune. Not only the chaos and the destruction that he saw firsthand, along with his angst, his poetic and adolescent and his angst about the uncertainty of his life. And and at the same time, the establishment of this government, the Paris Commune, embodying in this way, amidst all the destruction of society, the hope of a more attuned moral life and a conception of a people and a nation and a government and a philosophy that he was deeply involved in emotionally, like so many of the French were. I just want to mention in passing, I don't want to spend too much time on some things, but he wrote a poem early on about a blacksmith who was confronting Louis XVI, the historical poem. He read about it in a book. He read about Louis XVI, and so he wrote a long poem about a blacksmith speaking his mind to Louis XVI. And it was set, I think, 100 years before, about in 1792. There must have been a previous one of the many upheavals in France. By the way, this Franco-Prussian thing and this Paris Commune era came some 40 some odd years after what Victor Hugo, chronicles in Les Miserables. What do they call it? The July Monarchy, the end of the July Monarchy and the beginning of the Second Republic or Empire? I do not know. But anyway, this is even before that, the blacksmith talking to Louis XVI. But you see the voice of someone whom any idealist could identify with, living simply. He's speaking his mind to the monarch. The worker is the blacksmith, and the persona, of that is Rimbaud writing. Now and again we must have this heartbreaking dream of living simply, ardently, without grumbling, traveling under the august smile of a woman you love, with nobility. And we would work proudly through such a day, answering the call of duty like the ring of a trumpet. And we would feel so happy, and no one, above all, no one, could make us kneel. For we would have guns hanging above our hearths. Already it's a Patrick Henry kind of thing, isn't it? Not. Already our brethren are in the field. Why stand here we idle? What is it the gentlemen wish? What would they have? Is life so dear, or is peace so sweet to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it not, forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty, or give me death. Now, I wasn't quoting Rimbaud there. I was quoting Patrick Henry. But to remind you of a certain way, certain kinds of idealistic and explosive political rhetoric can combust in these memorable ways. It's part of the magic of the spoken word, and it's good, and it's bad. But let's go back to Rimbaud in the persona of this blacksmith speaking to Louis XVI. But the air is heavy with the breath of battle. What did I tell you? I'm part of the rabble. Snitches and thieves about, yet we are free. There are moments of terror where nonetheless we feel well, so well. Just now I spoke of a peaceful work of a home. Just look at the sky. It's too low. We'd die of heat. We'd have to kneel. Just look at the sky. I'm going back to the mob and to the terrible crowd. Sire, rolling your cannons over dirty streets. Oh, the streets will be clean when we die. And if, in the wake of our cries and our vengeance, the claws of old bronze kings drive regiments ready for battle across France, then all of you, what then? Then, you dogs, get ready to eat. S-H-I-T. But only he doesn't spell it out. He swung his hammer onto his shoulder. The soul of the mob felt drunk in his presence. And in the courtyard, in the apartments wherever Paris panted and cried, a shudder shook the teeming populace. Then, his great hand gleaming with grime, while the pot-bellied king sweated away, the blacksmith, terrifying to behold, tossed his red bonnet onto the king's head. That's Rimbaud writing. I just want to give you a taste of what was coursing through his emotions at that time, this identification with the working class and the ways that it would be fulfilled and the violent end that it came to. I want to tell you, Rimbaud came to Paris. The commune was just starting, and he only stayed a little while. He had some kind of trouble with the police, maybe traveling without a ticket. Spent some time in the calaboose, is that what they call it? In the jail. Also at the time, maybe another time, he tried to enlist in the National Guard or the Paris Guard, and that was the armed. Those were the armed defenders of the Paris Commune, and they were like city police, I guess. They were a National Army Guard. They were the ones who they put against the invading French army. And they were more used to reforming a political system and enjoying the cultural life and contributing to the cultural life of Paris and the world. And so they didn't have the equipment or the weapons to hold up against the onslaught of the French army. And that's why, they called it the Week of Blood. It was in the last week of May, I think, in 1871. And yes, they made a last stand at Montmartre. Louise Michel, she lived. She was sent to New Caledonia, the penal colony, one of a few, Devil's Island, New Caledonia, places like that. That's where the French sent their political prisoners. And there she spent a few years teaching the people there and refining her philosophy. When there was an amnesty some 9 or so years later, she came back to Paris, and she was now an anarchist. And this was because of what she had seen about what power can do, I guess. But she was still able to incite the crowds in Paris to a state of deep fervor, and with her view of a better world, and she could still openly defy the judges to put her to death, but the judges would not and did not do this. Perhaps she was had too much of a identity among the people at that time. I don't know. I just want to mention her. Rimbaud might not have known of her, though. I just want to say that also. Anyway, here's another poem of Rimbaud from The Roads. This is Rimbaud, a poem of the roads and of hopes. It is called My Bohemia, a Fantasy. And so off I went, fists thrust in the torn pockets of a coat held together by no more than its name. O Muse, how I served you beneath the blue, and oh, what dreams of dazzling love I dreamed. My only pair of pants had a huge hole, like some dreaming Tom Thumb. I sewed rhyme with each step. My inn was the Big Dipper. My stars rustled in the sky. Roadside, on warm September nights, I listened as the drops of dew fell on my forehead like fortifying wine. And there, surrounded by streaming shadows, I rhymed aloud, and as if they were lyres, plucked the laces of my wounded shoes, 1 foot beneath my heart. And so there it's a totally more inner kind of presentation of self. Whereas the psychedelic thing here, the muse is invisible, you understand. The muse is invisible, whom he speaks of serving. And yes, a coat held together by no more than its name. What power do words have to make things be the way that they are described, right? When he speaks of bubbling light, what is it in the word light that makes light light? Well, everything is there and nothing is there. Here's a poem about disillusionment, I guess you could say. It is called Evil. I'm sure we can reflect upon the aftermath of fall of the Paris Commune. Though I do want to mention that Rimbaud was in Charleville. He left Paris and was back in Charleville during the Week of Blood. And so he was in Charleville, and he spent time in Charleville, and then he came back to Paris, but that was only after this debacle had played itself out, or at least the open manifestation of it, the event, had already become the recent past, in these explosive times where it's just one thing after another. This is a poem where Rimbaud is, that he's seeing something with his eyes as well as his eyes. It is called Evil. When the cannon's red spittle whistles through the limitless blue skies, when scarlet and green forces crumble in fiery heaps at the feet of a jeering king, when an impossible madness grinds 100,000 men into a smoldering mass, such woeful dead in the summer grass, O nature, who makes saints of men. A god laughs away the finery of the holy sea, the incense and golden goblets, a god who dozes to hosannas, and then stirs when mothers gather in grief, crying in their black hats, offering him pennies from their pockets. So you see the loss, the mass loss. They say that some say it was like 200,000 casualties, others say it was 100 or 10,000. So there's a wide discrepancy. But either way, that's a whole lot in a very short time. And that was the end of the Paris Commune. And this is Rimbaud looking at all this in some way, reflecting on it, though he may well be talking about any war. The battles of his imagination are as real as the battles on the outside. And now let it also, this is part of the legend, something bad may have happened to him when he was in police custody, or when he tried to enlist in the city guard. So there, and so you can see that if this poem is autobiographical, and maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But imagine every contributing energy to everything that Rimbaud is presenting to us in the emotional life reflected in the poems. I say in the emotional life reflected in the poems, which may be Rimbaud's and maybe not, because remember, I is another. But this poem is called The Stolen Heart, and maybe it's recalling a certain kind of experience of violation. A stolen heart. My sad heart drools on deck, a heart splattered with chaw, a target for bowls of soup. My sad heart drools on deck, soldiers jeer and guffaw. My sad heart drools on deck, a heart spattered with chaw. Ithyphallic and soldierly, their jeers have soiled me. Painted on the tiller ithyphallic and soldierly, abracadabric seas, cleanse my heart of this disease. Ithyphallic and soldierly, their jeers have soiled me. When they've shot their wads, how will my stolen heart react? Bacchic fits and Bacchic starts when they've shot their wads. I'll retch to see my heart trampled by these clods. What will my stolen heart do when they've shot their wads? So, all the different forms of language you see, the vulgar, as well as the sublime, it's all right there. And so that so much is happening. I want to take a look at a different kind of creative narrative now that Rimbaud is also passing into and passing on to us. Note the language here now in terms of the desire for freedom from restriction of conventional poetic subject matter. Here's an excerpt from The Drunken Boat, La Bateau Ivre. Thereafter I bathed in the poem of the sea, milky with reflected stars, devouring blue and green. A drowned sailor sometimes floated by, like some pale apotheosis, or flotsam lost in thought. Love's bitter mystery suddenly blossoms beneath the blue, a slow delirium of rhythms, a redness infecting the burgeoning day, stronger than spirits, louder than lyres. I know skies split by lightning, waterspouts and undertows and tides. I know the night, and dawns exulting like a crowd of doves. I have even seen what man dreams he has. I have seen the low sun stained with mystic horror, lit with long violet wheels like actors in some ancient play, waves unrolling their shuddering paddles in the distance. I have dreamed green nights ablaze with snow, kisses climbing the eyes of the sea, unimaginable humors circulating freely, blue and yellow heavings of a phosphorescent song. Enough tears. Dawn breaks hearts. Every moon is wrong, every sun bitter. Love's bitter bite has left me swollen, drunk with heat. Let my hull burst. Let me sink into the sea. If I still long for Europe's waters, it's only for one cold black puddle where a child crouches sadly at its brink and releases a boat, fragile as a May butterfly, into the fragrant dusk. Bathed in your weary waves, I can no longer ride in the wake of cargo ships of cotton, nor cross the pride of flags and flames, nor swim beneath the killing stare of prison ships. That's a little bit of The Drunken Boat. Remember, it's in the persona of a boat. It's the boat who's telling us this as it drifts upon the rivers. Keep in mind the unknown humors, a swim within the limits of the corporal form or the soul form of the poet. Keep that in mind. Why? Because there's an accounting that we have to make for the changes in some of the poetic diction that we have surveyed a little bit. An accounting. And that accounting will come from Rimbaud himself, expressing his thoughts in a somewhat different way. For his letters are especially, the two letters involving his doctrine of the visionary and the poetic visionary and what that means, what it meant to him, the way that he was going to attain it, his conception of his experience of himself in relation to this knowledge kind of exploding out of him, I think, is given to us in these words, and we will never cease to find riches in contemplating it. We know that by now. So that's the beginning of how we could understand it. But anyway, this is a letter he wrote in 1871, 13th of May, 1871, just a few days before the Week of Blood in Paris. But like I say, he was in Charleville, and he was writing to a teacher of his, a mentor of his, a teacher, a high school teacher, you could say, the equivalent of, I think this is who this is, Jorg Isambard. I believe that was his teacher of his. And there was also Paul Demeny, a friend of his, I believe. And these were people to whom some of these letters with their specific subject matter were sent. Anyway, here's some of that. Here's some of the letter, the visionary letter from 1871. Rimbaud in a letter to Jorg Isambard. I want to be a poet, and I am working on becoming a visionary. You will never understand, and perhaps do not know how to make it, I do not know how to make it clear to you. You will never understand, and perhaps I do not know how to make it clear to you. The question is attaining what is unknown by a derailment of the senses. The sufferings are dreadful, but I must be strong, so that I will be born a poet, and I shall realize that I am a poet. This is not my fault at all. It is wrong to say, I think. You should say, I am thought. Excuse the play on words. I is the other. I am sorry for the wood that finds itself a violin, and I despise those who are unconscious, who quibble about things about which they are completely ignorant. The poet makes himself a voyant by a long, immense, and calculated derailment of all the senses, unspeakable torture, in which he needs all the faith, all the superhuman strength he can get, by which he becomes the great invalid, the great criminal, the great pariah above all others, and the supreme savant, for he attains the unknown. So, the poet is truly the fire stealer. He is responsible for humanity, even for animals. He must invent something that can be touched, felt, heard. If what he brings back from out there has a form, he gives it a form. If it is formless, he gives it a non-form. He will find a language. As any speech is thought, so the turn of universal language will come. It will be a language of the soul for the soul. And this is an entire world in these paragraphs. It is wrong to say, I think. You should say, I am thought. And what does he say further down? As any speech is thought, so there will come a time for a universal language. And then he talks about the derailment of the senses, or the derangement of the senses, that it is sometimes translated, all the forms of suffering and of madness. The poet exhausts them until he has dissolved them and he's left only with their quintessences. And if he goes mad and loses the understanding of his visions, at least he has seen them. This, that's also, it is part of us. It's part of the way we breathe, actually, this myth, this legend. But we got to look at it a little bit too. because we all have our own Rimbaud, and these things, as beautiful as they are, they can be misleading unless we interpret them to ourselves in a creative way. One form of creativity, when it is gone, will reappear in another place. We can see in this, reckless impetuosity, we can see the charismatic kind of quality of it, so that it's going to be believed, even if it weren't so profound, it would still fascinate us. I am thought. You see, and the main part is, I is the other. I is another. I am thought. It's like in realizing the simultaneity of time and eternity, it is lost what? Eternity. It is found again. What? Eternity, And in understanding that the way that the language puts itself together and dissolves and comes apart and comes together again, all in one simultaneous moment, one can only realize the obsoleteness of the self as conventionally defined. Give the self, in its understanding of itself, over to the living soul, which, of course, is there as the mind of your inspiration. And that is the other that you are. And remember, I is another, but I is also I. And so we got to understand, Descartes, made the formula so influential and just as open-ended as Rimbaud's is, I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum. Well, for Rimbaud, I think, therefore I am another. I think, but it is wrong to say I think. I am thought. So it's a very creative continuation of a creative dialogue with Descartes, only it comes out on the side of imagination. It comes out on the side of intuition, and it comes out on the side of what? Adventure and mystique. And this is how he creates his persona that still fascinates us. And it's archetypal in that it implies or it alludes to, this initiatory process, this shamanistic kind of initiatory process of suffering and an exhaustion of the unreal so as to arrive at a perception of the real. It's like Shiva's third eye, the beam, the destroyer of illusion, so that the truth can be seen. It's like a Shivaic, poetic. It's universal, utterly universal. And that's when he's speaking of the universal language. It opens the door into the way that we are to creatively understand it, each of us, for ourselves. And so this is given to us. And if it in the visions there is a form is given. If it is formless, he gives it a non-form, you see. And so the energy, the conceptual energy, is swirling all around, and it takes new forms constantly as we ourselves come to grips with it. So this is visionary language, you see, and it's language that is, hearkening. There are so many ways we could speak of his literary influence. It is hearkening to a whole kind of intuitive and unitarian visionary way of seeing the world and seeing one's own self and seeing that experience of dislocation and everything, and of being utterly so present to the language that the language, even as it emerges from fractured time, from shards of space, is whole in and of itself. And so I want to go then knowing that things must be touched on only in passing. These are preliminary scratch marks on the face of on the face of a cloud. Our understanding of Rimbaud. Now I want to jump ahead to the illuminations. These are some, the culmination, in a certain sense, of his visible, conventionally conceived poetic trajectory. Nearing the end of his literary quote-unquote career as a poet in Paris and all this, before embarking upon a peripatetic life of adventure, where, and remember this always, he does not cease to write. You still have images of what he sees in his travel and a portrait of his character, and in the letters that he wrote to his family and to various people around him, in the guise under the functionings of various things, a quarry foreman, a coffee merchant, an assembler of a caravan into the hinterlands of Abyssinia, a gather together of goods, a squabbler, and over goods and determining their prices in various languages and various cultures, in the Horn of Africa. And always the vocabulary is there. Everything that I'm saying we know of by his letters, by his writing. He does not cease to write. In that sense, he does not cease to create. He never seemingly, as near as I can see, maybe I might be predisposed to believe this, but he seems incapable of crafting an uninteresting sentence. I don't say, that it's not vulgar or troubling or any number of things, boastful, impetuous. It's all of these things. This is part of the mystique. I want to read to you, though, a little bit of a prose poem called Lives. It is in the Illuminations. And I want to somehow suggest, to you that in these lines, in this prose poem called Lives, to me at least, I see the sentences are like conceived of in the very crux or the very midst of a simultaneous understanding of every world of meaning that each utterance, each line, each meaning, each thought belongs to. Only it's brought into being, as a living, breathing thing that you can see and touch and before your eyes of imagination, which is why it's a poem. Anyway, it's called Lives. Oh, the vast avenues of the Holy Land, the terraces of the temple. What became of the Brahmin who taught me the proverbs? From there, I still see images, even of old women. I remember hours of silver and sun along rivers, the hand of the land upon my shoulder, and our caresses in the fragrant fields. A rising flock of scarlet pigeons thunders through my thoughts. In exile, life was a stage where literature's masterpieces were played out. I could share untold riches that remain unknown. I watch you unearth your discoveries. I know what will be. My wisdom? You disdain it like chaos. What is my nothingness in the face of the stupor awaiting you? I'm an inventor, unique among my predecessors. Think of me as a musician who has discovered the key of love. For now, a gentleman from a barren land and a sober sky, I try to stir myself with memories of a beggar's boyhood, my apprenticeship, days in wooden shoes, arguments, 5 or 6 unimaginable losses, and a few wild nights where my stubbornness kept me from losing it completely. I don't regret my earlier allotment of divine joy. The sobriety of this desolate landscape nourishes my wild skepticism. But because this skepticism no longer has its place, and since I'm consumed with a brand new mess, I'm destined to become a miserable kook. I met the world in an attic. I was confined at 12. There, I furnished illustrations to the human comedy. I learned history in a cellar. At some nocturnal celebration in a northern city, I met a woman who modeled for the old masters. I was schooled in the sciences in a Paris back alley. I made my own masterpieces and retired to an appropriately magnificent oriental retreat. I brewed my blood. My burden was lifted. My brooding was over. I am beyond all parting and past persuading. Ah, as Rilke said of Holderlin, ah, after such an eternal life, why do we still mistrust the earthly instead of learning from transience the emotions for what purer slopes of the heart in pure space? All right, my friends, the time has come, I believe, because I want to have this talk not be so tediously long. I'll say just a little bit more, actually. I have a strange idea in my mind. But before I go into that idea, I want to stay with what it still remains in my mind of that poem that I just read by Rimbaud called Lives from Illuminations. That manuscript exists because Rimbaud in 1875 was it that late in Stuttgart after having abandoned poetry for a while. He handed that manuscript to Verlaine. And as I understand it, Verlaine saw to it that it entered into, the stream of literary documents that reach us now. And yeah, Rimbaud was only published by his own volition, actually, a couple times in reviews of the time, actually. The great portion of his vast work, and it still is inscrutable in the ways that it appears, as you understand, it's the work, it's juvenilia, it's assembling. Different people have different manuscripts in his beautiful and sometimes showy writing hand. And different versions of different poems exist, and the images themselves are so explosive they lend themselves to this kind of energy of gathering together. And at the same time, we can experience, I believe it's there again and again, the image of an eternal presence, of a spiritual and mystical aesthetic presence, somehow part of the energy and intelligence and, dare I say it, love of the cosmos, because love of invisible things, is the impetus for the inspiration that creates masterpieces of literature. Okay, that being said, when I say I is another, maybe I'll just tell you really quickly about Alla Mazurtova, if I'm saying her name right. A Hollywood actress. Everyone, has a certain element in them that can be illuminated when you think about Rimbaud and then consider them in their own story. If I can just do this compressed, I just have this wild idea. She came from the Ukraine. She came from Yalta in the mid-1910s, and she was a silent movie actress. Her name was Alla Nazimova. That's her name. And she became a famous and powerful movie star. She was paid a higher salary than Mary Pickford. She got power, decision-making authority over the director and the script and the leading man that she would appear with. This was, by 1918. And she bought a big house on Sunset Boulevard. And it was her mansion for a while. And it became a gathering place for the Hollywood intelligentsia in the teens, the 19-teens. The salons, there was literature, there was art, there was philosophy, there was theater. It was notorious for its sewing circles, you might say. Various erotic tastes, people who gathered there. But then, of course, hard times came economically, and investors convinced her to remodel the place and to build bungalows there and turn it into kind of a resort or a hotel. And it became a place called the Garden of Allah, after her, Alla Nazimova. I think she might have added an H to the end of that word. And a great many stars and writers, F. Scott Fitzgerald, wrote himself a postcard there. When I say I is another, let me quote F. Scott Fitzgerald in a postcard written to himself while he was a resident at the Garden of Allah. he wrote to himself, "Dear Scott, how are you? Have been meaning to come in and see you. I have been living at the Garden of Allah. Yours, Scott Fitzgerald." And then here's a letter that Thomas Wolfe of You Can't Go Home Again, he wrote a letter to F. Scott Fitzgerald saying, "I'll be damned if I'll believe anyone lives in a place called the Garden of Allah." And so there was a hotel swimming pool that she made in the shape of the Black Sea, a la Nazimova did, and which I guess was a semicircle, and she carved her initials under the water line at a certain spot. And I don't know, it was there that Tallulah Bankhead and Johnny Weissmuller made some waves of their own, you see. So I just want to throw that, such a life, you can imagine, when I was kind of trying to say that what Rimbaud is alluding to in his most visionary writings is this sense where these sudden, not sudden, but all at once, poetic histories, underground inner histories, can appear before the visions of the mind, so it's not like the visions are just surface stimulation, you see. I mean, right? The bubbling of light. Something else is going on. Communications are happening, messages, you could say. The awareness of existence as a gift, but as well as a responsibility to make the world intelligible. To make the world intelligible in the way that appears to these artists like Rimbaud, like Alla Nazimova, like F. Scott Fitzgerald, like Thomas Wolfe, and others, Tallulah Bankhead, and even Johnny Weissmuller, who have somehow become part of a story that we know, and we know, but sometimes it takes the imagery of inspired poetic speech to remind us that if it has a form, it is given a form, and if it has a non-form, it is given a non-form. And that's the nature of what we still are working with and what we still are shaping with our own hands, with our own breath, with the energies of our imaginations. And then I just wanted to say really one quick thing too, because it's almost unbelievable. I mean, if I want to imitate Tallulah Bankhead, the best thing about Tallulah Bankhead to me is when she was asked by Edward R. Murrow, "Why do you call everyone darling?" "I call everyone darling because I can't remember their names." and this was her answer, yes. And so right there is a beautiful poem. Let me quote a Sufi thinker from the 10th century, Nifari. Even names have names. Even the name has a name. So it's like the mystery of language, you might say. I call them darling because I cannot remember their names. But anyway, Rimbaud in a school book exercise, like I just imitated Tallulah Bankhead, darling, Rimbaud imitated Apollonius Molos. Apollonius Molos was a speech teacher. Apollonius Molos was a Greek, but he was living in Roman times. Apollonius Molos was an important speech teacher to Cicero, Marcus Tullius Cicero, and to Julius Caesar. He was their teacher. Rimbaud, as a school exercise, but more than that, this is the exercise of his mystical gift. He imitated Apollonius the Greek, making a speech in honor of Marcus Cicero, the Cicero that is, who was the student of the Apollonius Molos, who is being interpreted now by Rimbaud, only translated into English by Wyatt Mason and read by me. So this is a speech given by the great speech teacher Apollonius in honor of the great speaker Cicero. "You have heard, my disciples, Cicero's speech, in which he seemed convincingly Greek during a speech in Greek, truthful in making fiction seem fact, and not a bit like a boy in a schoolboy exercise, and such penetrating argumentation, such acuity and discernment in his articulation of the facts, such force and heart-breaking peroration, and above all, such elegance and abundance in shape of expression, How magnificently the periods fall into place, one upon the next. It's no accident that nature wished to decorate Cicero with every gift. Rome needs him to hearken back to the eloquence of the Greece, the eloquence of Brutus. Real trials demand his attention. Real thieves that deserve denunciation in the name of innocence and of art itself. Courage, then, young man. And it goes on. But even in so great a joy lurks a sadness and regret. For though I do not hesitate an instant in praising the intelligence and eloquence of Marcus Tullius Cicero, I cannot forget that he is a Roman. You, Cicero, who best of all my other pupils are Roman, a Roman I shaped and taught. All of Greece has been overrun by Rome. It consoles itself, perhaps, over the loss of its liberty, with the thought that though in its might it holds no dominion over the earth, though Greece in its might holds no dominion over the earth, its genius still does. So he's speaking from a civilization in a certain sense that has passed, and yet the intelligence of that civilization lives on in what Apollonius taught to Cicero, which Apollonius is articulating in his speech. Anyway, it goes on from there, but I need not go more, except to say, since the ineluctable laws of the gods has decided that it will be conquered, Rome will, and be scorned as Greece was before it, this mother, this wet nurse of warriors, all thoughts or ideas of glory are driven from our minds. All that remains to us is the consolation of the arts, of study and thought. For it is the joy that remains within our sorrow, some shade of liberty within servitude. We turn our gaze away from our present humiliation and instead towards the dignity of the ancient authors. We rejoice at the sweet dialogue mined from within their books between Homer and Plato and the like. Not about public matters that aren't ours to decide any longer, but instead about poetry, the immortal gods, and all the subjects about which these great ones so admirably spoke. So even in his persona as an old Greek teacher in a conquered culture, he feeds us with ideas that we can bring to our reading of his more visionary, or his more characteristically visionary texts in works like the Illuminations and things. So yes, Rimbaud is a hermetic author in a certain sense. One needs, to my view, to have a kind of an orientation to bring to it. Otherwise it will be too mystifying. And then perhaps one can get used to that sense of mystification and understand the deep aesthetic richness and pleasure of it as we practice in studying this. So Rimbaud is a person of many masks, and he is still wearing these masks, and he's appearing to us through these masks of his writings. So deeply indeed we realize he is an artist of thought and a sage with much wisdom for us to creatively work with on our own. So at that note, on that point, I will thank you for your heroic listening. And I will say to you, so long for now, from Radio Rimbaud.